On January 1st, 1926, a football team from Alabama stepped onto a field nearly 2,000 miles from home. They weren't expected to win. They weren't expected to belong. The invitation almost never came. The journey west felt like a spectacle, and the game itself became a referendum on Southern football. What happened that afternoon in Pasadena didn't just crown a champion, it changed the national map of the sport. This is the story of the 1925 Alabama team and the Rose Bowl that announced the South to America.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's my honor and pleasure to have with us on our Crimson Chronicles podcast today Mark Mayfield, my dear friend of almost 50 years. Mark and I served on the Crimson White staff together, 1976 through 78. His senior year was when he was editor of the Crimson White, and I was sports editor of the Crimson White during the 77-78 season. We've remained great friends ever since. Mark has a celebrated career in journalism, being a magazine publisher for years, and is now a journalism professor at the University of Alabama. He is also my co-author of a book called Remember the Rose Bowl, soon to be published by the Bryant Museum. And we have worked long and hard on this project, and hopefully it'll be out soon. But Mark, it's great to have you.
Tommy, thanks. It's great to be here. And also, Rick, thank you. I've enjoyed the podcast. So you guys are doing incredible work and some all-star guests, that's for sure. This is you all have had wonderful guests, and I'm just glad to be along for the ride here. You're doing great work, and it's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be here with you. Thank you.
Well, Mark, we're really excited to have you. I'm excited to have you because it sounds like you've been doing the heavy lifting for Tommy for a long time.
No question.
I think we've lifted each other pretty well.
I'm just messing with you, messing with him. But man, we really are glad to have you and excited to talk about this. And you know, this is really an appropriate conversation for right now because of where we are with the current Rose Bowl that's right here upon us, but the fact that we get to celebrate a 100th anniversary. And so maybe as we get started, let's just start at the beginning talk to us about the national context and just the reputation of Southern football prior to that 1925 season.
Well, I think it's impossible to overstate the importance of that season and this game, right? Tommy can talk a lot about the season itself. When you look back at it, and we're up on the 100th anniversary now, it's just incredible to look back and see the impact that season, and particularly the Rose Bowl victory itself had on Alabama football. There's a lot of hyperbole about sports and any other subject out there, but I don't think you can have that much hyperbole on this one. It meant everything to Alabama football and also to Southern football, which was not respected at that point until Alabama comes along with that game and Wallace Wade, or the team, 25 season, and Wallace Wade and his team, and an all-star lineup of players, and what they did in that Rose Bowl, the 1926 Rose Bowl, has never been forgotten. We're 100 years out and we're not forgetting it. That's how big it was.
That's right. Well, Tommy, walk us through that 1925 season about Alabama's dominance and, you know, why, how could a team be that dominant? I think had not to steal your thunder, but a 9-0 record and still have uncertainty about whether we would be invited to the Rose Bowl. And so dig into that for us.
Yeah. Well, it all starts with Wallace Wade. Mark mentioned him, and Wallace Wade came to Alabama 2 years before that, 1923. We had a pretty good run under Zen Scott and a great win in 1922 against Penn, which kind of put us on the Southern football map. But not until the 1925 season and the 26 Rose Bowl did we become a national name, not just a Southern name, but a national name. But Wallace Wade had come in 1923, was a very stern disciplinarian, had a 7-2-1 record in 23, 8-1 record in 24. So things were getting much better. There was the media that covered his beginnings here talked about how much tougher and more disciplined the squad was, you know, in that 1923, 24, 25 era than it had been under Zen Scott. They loved Zen Scott, but he unfortunately succumbed to cancer, and so it had to resign before he passed away. But the 25 season is what we're here to talk about. And Zip Newman, the great Birmingham News writer, before the season. He observed some of the practices and talked about what a great talent Alabama had going into the 25 season, especially the backs, the running backs. And you're talking about Johnny Mack Brown and Pooley Hubert and Grant Gillis and Red Mars and Herschel Caldwell and Johnny Mack's little brother, Red Brown. But this team finished 9-0. They scored 277 points to 7. Only Birmingham Southern scored. They had 8 shutouts, and Birmingham Southern scored 7 points. They were the first undefeated, untied team, not counting the 1897 team, which went 1-0, but they were the first undefeated, untied team in Alabama history. And the great thing about this team was 21 of the 24 on the roster were from the state of Alabama. And if you look down at their roster, it's small town Alabama, it's small town America, that made up this roster. And they finished 9-0, and Mark may get into this a little more, but there was some buzz that the Rose Bowl was kind of ready to maybe make I don't want to say an exception, but to include a Southern team in the Rose Bowl, because traditionally it was called an East-West matchup. And just about every game prior to then had been somebody from the East, or in some cases we call it the North, and somebody from the West. It was a wonderful season, and there were no bowls back then other than the Rose Bowl. That was the only game in town. Season was great, and there were no rankings at the time. All we knew was we finished 9-0, and talk started happening toward the end of the season about maybe we could get out west and go to the Rose Bowl, and how important that would be.
So Mark unpacked what, there was a lot to the reasoning why we might not have made it even after an undefeated season. There was a lot of bias that was going on in the world. Talk a little bit about.
Yeah, again, as Tommy said, there'd never been a Southern team invited to go play the West Coast team. They'd always come from the East Coast, basically, but not the Deep South. And any of the Southern Conference teams, 22 teams, none of them had ever been invited. And so part of that was certainly a bias, I think, within the tournament committee, back then, but also what had happened over the period, a couple of years before Alabama finally got this invitation and was the team to go out to the 26 Rose Bowl. It was a pretty important thing, a change made at the Rose Bowl in terms of how they invited people. And it came about because of some arguing over gate receipts, how things were going to be done. The University of Washington, which Alabama would eventually play, had played there a couple of years before Alabama played them. They had an experience that, they weren't happy with everything. They ended up tying the game with Navy, I think. But the tournament committee basically handed over the invitation authority to the Pacific Coast Conference at that time. And so the representatives of the Pacific Coast Conference would represent the Rose Bowl, like the athletic directors of the teams within the Pacific Coast Conference would represent the Rose Bowl from that point on, and inviting the team from the East for the East-West game, as Tommy mentioned, is what it was called at the time. So that happened. And then, Alabama was doing so well. And part of it was, Tommy mentioned Zip Newman, the Birmingham News, a great sports editor back then, and just was, one of the most incredible writers in the country at that time. And his work was sometimes carried on the West Coast. I mean, he was not, as Birmingham News and Birmingham Herald and other papers did as well, carrying stories from the West Coast here. So one of the things Zip made a point of mentioning in his column one time was the fact that the West Coast players were, the players on Alabama's team were known by some of the readers in West Coast newspapers. And Johnny Mack Brown, Pooley Hubert, these were becoming names to some extent. Mm-hmm. So once Alabama started going on this run, as Tommy mentioned, later in the season, it was about the Florida game, which was November the 14th that year. And Alabama beat Florida 34-0. And all of a sudden, AP runs a story talking about their rumors, talking about rumors. They always said AP was in the business of reporting on rumors, but in this case, they sort of did. And they were talking about the rumors that were coming out of Pacific Coast Conference, saying that the Southern Conference champion might be invited to Pasadena for the 1926 Rose Bowl. So the talk really started ramping up. Alabama and Tulane were fighting for the Southern Conference championship. They weren't playing each other, but they were playing. There were 22 teams in this conference. So it wasn't decided at that point who would be the Southern Conference champion. Alabama had one more game to play. That was against Georgia. It was played on Thanksgiving Day on November the 26th. Once they beat Georgia 27-0 at Legion Field in Birmingham, it exploded with more talk around the papers. The LA Times jumped in even before the Georgia game, saying Alabama was basically on a par with Dartmouth, which was the big team that everybody was thinking might get the invitation. Dartmouth and Colgate. Others have been mentioned, Princeton, others. But it came down to Dartmouth, Colgate, and Alabama, or the Southern Conference champion. Alabama was named the Southern Conference champion by the group of sports writers who would get together, and Alabama got the Champ Pickens Trophy as the champion of the Southern Conference. That was named for an Alabama booster, by the way. Pickens, who became their publicity director on this trip to the Rose Bowl, and did an incredible job. And a lot of what we hear about the game today, he was working with the media at that time. Anyway, long story short, Dartmouth and Colgate, both, some of the faculty, keep in mind, this was the winter in the Northeast. And, in terms of Dartmouth, Colgate, there was some talk about they wouldn't be able to really practice. There were no indoor practice facilities then. They wouldn't be able to practice in snow, that kind of thing. Those little things came to bear, but some of the faculty too. There were a lot of different things about the invitation. And then there were rumors that even though Alabama was chosen Southern Conference champion, Tulane would get the bid or get the invitation. Dartmouth and Colgate basically were the original teams that seemed to have the inside track for the invitation. There's a lot of talk that they were issued the invitation. The person who was heading up the committee was the athletic director, or called the graduate manager for athletics, but that was the athletic director at that point for Oregon. He was the one handling the actual invitation. And there was a lot of criticism in the Alabama press, Zip Newman and others, about how this was being handled. Alabama President George Mike Denny were getting frustrated over it as well. Bottom line is they finally were invited on December the 6th. Alabama got the invitation. It was issued at the Tutwiler Hotel in Birmingham. Benefield came down to Birmingham, and he'd been in Chicago for a conference. He comes down to Birmingham, gives them the invitation in person, had telegraphed before that they were going to get the invitation. And so Alabama gets it. But there's a lot. We use an entire chapter on this in the book, because there's so much to it. In the end, though, Alabama gets the invitation, and everything overnight turned from some criticism of how the invitation happened, this incredible opportunity Bama had in the press and the media.
Well,
and so
I think, Mark, for those of us that are not historians like you and Tommy, I think that you may initially hear the idea of Dartmouth and Colgate and not really think of that in the kind of stunning terms that it is. But for the University of Alabama to be considered in the same breath with schools like Dartmouth and Colgate would be tantamount today to a program that was maybe lesser, being on par with today, Alabama or Georgia. It's
Right.
for us to imagine a world where we were that far off the national stage, and yet that was really the case then.
Yeah, absolutely. As Tommy mentioned, with Zen Scott, Alabama had gone up to Philadelphia, upset Penn in 1922. That was the first time they had gone north like that outside of the Southern Conference. It was a huge upset. Suddenly, I think people were starting to say, well, maybe these Southern teams aren't so bad, but there was a real bias because of the Colgates and Dartmouths and Princetons. Those were the big teams. Penn at one point had Alabama was founded by, some folks that, or was coached by some folks that had ties to UPenn, that kind of thing. William Little, is probably all of your viewers know, that Bill Little, and he has a story. There's a story about him in the book about this Rose Bowl, the 26-2, in terms of meeting the team on their way back. Anyhow, yeah, it's kind of incredible. But when we talk about the Yay Alabama song, part of that song has got Swanee in there. Swanee was a big team too in the South. But we would think of them as the Colgates and the Dartmouths.
That's right.
And these were powers back then, big time college football powers.
Well, you mentioned the song, so let's turn the corner on that for just a second and talk about the line in there about the Rose Bowl. Remember the Rose Bowl, we'll win then. And that line making its way into the fight song, talk through how that happened and the story behind that little piece of history.
Yeah. Well, Tommy and I worked together on the Crimson White, the
Mhm.
student newspaper at UA, right? And I am so proud of the fact that it was the Crimson White editor-in-chief who wrote that song and composed the music.
Love it.
And I don't know about Tommy, but I'm not exactly a musician. And think that a CW editor could do that, right? Not only was he a good journalist, but he had a flair for music. And
That's
as
fantastic.
some of his friends said, he had a penchant for piano. He could play
Mm.
that piano and he could compose music. And so he started on the Crimson White. He really started with a couple editorials on the Crimson White saying, we need our own fight song. This was during the 1925 season, saying we need our own fight song because the fight song was something that they had borrowed from Washington Lee University. Called the song was called "The Swing," and so that was Alabama's fight song. And so the CW editor, a guy named Ethelred Lundy Sykes, nicknamed Ep EPP, but Ep Sykes was saying we need this fight song. Got this great team playing, and so the Rammer Jammer, which were the humor magazine at the time,
Mhm.
and later on Harper Lee became editor of that magazine on campus, right back in the 40s. Years later, so the Rammer Jammer took up the mantle after Ep Sykes, talked about it in editorial in the CW, and the Rammer Jammer offered $50 for first prize for anyone who
Mm.
could write and compose a new fight song for the University of Alabama. $50. I remember, I think in the book we mentioned in terms of an inflation calculator, about $900 today. It was like a lot of money. And so Ep was one of the ones who wrote the song, and the Rose Bowl, of course, the rest is history. I mean, what we say in the book, though, and I didn't know, we looked into this in terms of the history, is there is some evidence that, because you think, well, he wrote the song after the game, right after Alabama won it. But according to Frank Bromberg Sr., who was one of his best friends, who was one of Ep Sykes's best friends at the time, and they were in they were, I don't know if they were fraternity brothers or in different fraternities, but they were close friends. And Frank Fromberg Jr. wrote a letter years later saying that his dad had told him that Ep Sykes actually wrote it right before the game. And the time before Alabama received the invitation, which would have been on December 6th, until the Rose Bowl itself, which was January 1, that he wrote the song and he played it at a fraternity house on campus for a few friends the first time. And then it caught on. It was, it didn't catch on in time for the game itself, but Rammer Jammer later in the following spring published the lyrics to it, published the composition. Ep Sykes used his money, which I thought was pretty cool. He used his winnings, the $50 to pay to have sheet music printed for the $1 million band to play the song. So it's a wonderful story. And as we say in the book, whether it was written before or after, there's evidence maybe now it was before based on the Bromberg letter. Either way, it was based on that Rose Bowl, and so it's pretty remarkable. And again, I'm just so happy it was a Crimson White editor-in-chief. He was also an engineering student, by the way.
And you hear this story, though, and there's so much about it that's just incredible. I mean, the fact that this group of young men from all over the state of Alabama, most of them probably had hardly been outside the state of Alabama before the opportunity to play football here, and now they have the opportunity to go to the Rose Bowl. This was a huge deal for the university, for the state. And so the optimism about winning, I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of thought that this could be something that could really show that our state and this part of the country really belonged on the same par with everyone else in America, which was not necessarily widely believed outside the South. And we wanted to show that. So then we have this group of players and coaches that take a train trip. Oh, Tommy, you got something?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you, not only did they remember the Rose Bowl will win then, got into that song, but when the term "send the Yellow Jackets to a watery grave" came from that year's Georgia Tech game, because the game was played in mud.
Yeah.
We had beaten the Bulldogs in our last game of the season on Thanksgiving Day to secure the Rose Bowl bid.
Right.
So that song is almost like a summary of the whole 25 season. And here we are 100 years later singing it today.
Yeah, it's crazy. But so then, so Mark, we frame this up and we've got this traveling band that heads out by train bound for Pasadena. Just give us a little bit of an essence of a description of that train trip. And there were some rather remarkable things that happened along the way that are part of the lore, right?
Yeah. I mean, this was one of the most fun parts of the research Tommy and I did for this book. I just feel like that, it had been written about the train, but we look back at individual stories, hundreds of stories from the rides. And I didn't know the depth of this until we did this project. There were sports writers like Zip Newman, which we've talked about on that train ride. Another one, Howard Pill, who was an excellent writer, an LA writer later as they got towards, we'll talk about, they went to the Grand Canyon on this trip. An LA writer, Braven Dyer, joined them at the Grand Canyon and rode with them the rest of the way back to Pasadena. But these writers, Jeff Coleman was one of the ones who was a kid. He was a student. He was assistant to Wallace Wade. And Jeff Coleman, of course, his name's on our Coliseum here. But, you all knew him. I mean, he became years later the business manager of athletics, later head of the National Alumni Association, all these wonderful things. But he was also a very good writer. And he did the dispatches just like the other reporters did from the train. So, there was obviously no internet. And so what was happening, and I guess what I didn't realize, of course, I knew growing up in journalism that all these daily papers around the country had different editions during the day. It was kind of, they wouldn't have one edition, the morning paper, their afternoon papers, but even the afternoon paper would continue to update it. And so when these guys would make a stop on the train, they would call in their dispatches, and from the train. So it got to be incredible. The New York Times, from the New York Times to the LA Times to the Seattle, all the way across the country, these dispatches were making headlines of the Alabama team. And what I didn't realize is that Washington made a couple of mistakes during this thing to lose this game. But one of the mistakes I believe they made, and I love the University of Washington, don't get me wrong, I've been to the campus, it's fantastic. One of the things I don't think they realized is the publicity Alabama was drawing, because Washington stayed at home in Seattle and didn't come to Pasadena until the day before the game. Alabama went out there early, arrived in Pasadena on Christmas Eve morning. They were out there the entire week, but all along the ride, this train ride they were getting dispatches all over the country. They went north instead of the direct line south. They started in Tuscaloosa. They backtracked to Birmingham. They went through Nashville. They went on all the way to St. Louis, then to Kansas City, and then they're just hit with snowstorm. This was a major cold that gripped the country, coming all the way down to Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, freezing temperatures then. But as they went further north, the more snow and all of that, and to see some of the dispatches, but there was a town in Kansas, for instance, that they finally were delayed so many times that they made an abrupt change and started heading back down south earlier than they thought. So they kind of made a beeline from Kansas City through the Kansas snow and all the way down to Texas and over into New Mexico or to Texas Panhandle, over to New Mexico, Arizona, that way. But coming through the snow, they got out. Wade was wanting them to keep limber, so they'd try to get out when they could, but they were actually going to do a little workout at one point, this place called Wellington, Kansas, and they couldn't because the snow drove them in. It was like a blizzard going on. They drove them back into the train, that kind of thing. So we go into great depth on the chapter of the invitation, but to me, it was really incredible. And some of the dispatches, but one of the really interesting things, there was a day where two different headlines, one was on the Atlanta Constitution talking about the boys were enjoying the snow. And another headline was in the New York Times saying the snowfall dismays Alabama 11 because of the delays. And those two things can be true at the same time. Right. They were loving the snow, but it was keeping them from getting to Pasadena at the time they wanted. So anyway, bottom line is they make those changes. They end up at the Grand Canyon. They got there overnight. Howard Pill, who was the sports editor of the Birmingham Herald at the time, said they attacked the shower baths at the El Tovar Hotel, which is right on the crest of the canyon. If you've been, it's still there. If you've been to the Grand Canyon South Rim, they attacked the showers because they arrived in dark. The next morning when they can see it, and these folks had been there, they could see it. It was stunning to them. And Zip wrote something like, I'm trying to quote him here, "There's no describing this freak of nature that spreads 13 miles across, 17 miles long, and is 8,000 feet deep."
Wow.
Those stars were falling all over themselves trying to describe this place that they had never seen. It was incredible. So I love that. I love that part. I think we do a good job in the book, not only in this, but Tommy and I both talking about the train ride chapter, but talking about throughout the book about the incredible work that these original sports writers did and leaving us this record to go look at. That was great. But they arrived in Pasadena, and then Wallace Wade, being Wallace Wade, took them right to practice. They went to the hotel first, had some pictures made with some Rose Bowl representatives, all that, and then they're out in the Rose Bowl practicing that afternoon that they arrived on Christmas Eve. They're out there,
Amazing.
and the hotel for a party, which was great. Anyhow, it's an incredible story about the train ride.
Well, listening to you talk about the dispatch is obviously an incredibly different time, but it reminds me of what we see today in the lead up to, say, the national championship game, where you have a little bit of extra time, and Sports Center all day long has the team. They did a press event, they went to practice, and these little snippets that we get all day long. Well, in that world, people were still trying to do that at some level. There were all these reporters that were sending dispatches, and you had newspapers that were competing against one another to be the ones that picked up the story and were able to tell the thing that nobody else knew. And so incredible. But Tommy, we get there and they're there, and now Coach Wade has to balance keeping a team focused in the middle of Southern California with all the things that Southern California brings. And, Mark told us, like, he's taking them to practice right away. But what did that look like in balancing preparation, and how do you keep those Southern boys focused to get them ready for the game?
Well, he made it clear on the train ride that this was going to be a fun trip, but yet it would be a business trip. And they had to study every day, every night with notes. They had some scouts out there that had sent them game reports on Washington and all. So when they arrived, they certainly knew all about Washington. And so it was a matter of staying loose, keeping their mind on the game. As Mark mentioned, when they rolled into Pasadena, they went to the Huntington Hotel, had breakfast, got some pictures, and we have some of those photos in the book. Yeah. And they went straight to the Rose Bowl that afternoon for practice. And the reports were that it was not an easy practice. Coach Wade was so anxious to get out there and actually practice that it's one of the hardest practices. I don't remember which reporter said it's one of the most brutal practices he'd ever seen. Now, keep in mind, they were 8 days still away from the game. So, and nowadays, and I've been to plenty of bowl games with our teams, they've got something every night for the teams. The Oklahoma game, that was a road game for us when we beat Oklahoma in Norman. Strictly a road game. Go the day before, it wasn't considered a bowl.
Yeah.
Now, right now, the Rose Bowl playing Indiana is a little different. There'll be some team activities, but the CFP has kind of changed the whole mentality of the bowl. Used to, you'd have all kinds of events. Even back then, one thing Coach Wade did was take them to the studios. And back then, the film industry was booming, starting to boom in the 1920s. And talkies were relatively new at the time. Back then, it was silent movies, but yet they still had to film them like anything else. So
Sure.
Coach Wade did take them to the studios, and we've got some photos of some of that. And of course, later on, not at this trip, because Johnny McBrown was a player, an outstanding halfback for us. When Wallace Wade was still the coach, Coach Wade loaded up the bus and said, we're going to go on a trip. And they went out to an orange grove and picked 2 oranges each. And that was the entertainment. They got to pick 2 oranges. But Coach Wade did balance. And I would say if it was a true set of scales, it would probably weigh toward practicing more than going sightseeing. Imagine 100 years ago, going out to Pasadena and the Rose Bowl, the San Gabriel Mountains, and the beauty of it all. And these guys, probably most of them had never been out of Alabama other than maybe a football trip to Atlanta or Knoxville or wherever. But can you imagine going across the country for 5 days? Many of them maybe seeing heavy snow for the first time, seeing the Grand Canyon. Are you kidding? and then getting to Pasadena when it's probably 80 degrees. But Coach Wade was very deliberate in his there. Now, keep in mind, he had played in the Rose Bowl when he was a player at Brown. So he had been there before, been in Pasadena, and it wasn't the same stadium as they were playing in, but he had been there. So he had a little bit of experience in being in that environment. And I think that was key. And he balanced it pretty well, but I do think it leaned probably toward the practice sessions.
Well, again, and I think one of our big objectives in this podcast is to bring the past to the present and to help people to really be able to connect. And, I hear you guys talk about that, and it's not different than the mindset that we've seen our teams take. And I mean, even in recent years, Coach Saban has talked about things being a business trip. You hear that refrain from players that we're not coming to play, we're coming to focus, and we're on a business trip. And you can go all the way back to Coach Wade and the 25 team and their trip out there for this 26 Rose Bowl. That has been a consistent thing. And we see that with Coach Bryant, and it's a thread. Well, Tommy, we get to the game itself. Talk about the game. Tell us, kind of give us a breakdown. Folks, I'm sure know the outline a little bit, but what happened when they finally lined it up?
Well, it was all about George Wildcat Wilson, and he was not one of our players. He was the Washington superstar. And they had heard all about him, and it didn't take them long to realize what a hoss he was. Yeah, because he really showed out for the Rose Bowl crowd in that, in the first quarter especially. But then there was some really strange things that happened in the game. First of all, we were trailing 12-0 at the half, and it had been pretty much dominated by Washington. And we had our chances, but George Wilson was tough to stop. And of course, back then they played both ways. So he was an all-star on defense and an all-star on offense. And, he ended up rushing for 134 yards in that game, completed 5 passes for 77 yards, 2 touchdowns. But the key was injury. An injury put him out of the game once in the second quarter. He got knocked out and hauled off, literally, and came back in his best Lazarus impression in the fourth quarter, but it was too late. He was out of the game for 22 minutes, and that's when we scored all 20 of our points. That shows you how good he was.
Wow.
And anyway, long story short, we're down 12-0 at the half. We come back and score 20 points in the third quarter.
Yeah.
To go ahead 20-12, and then they scored a late touchdown. And back then there were no 2-point conversions, so they had to kick the extra point. And keep in mind, they had missed 2 extra points on their 2 touchdowns. So it was 6-0 Washington after the first quarter, 12-0 at the half. They missed both extra points. And then we scored 20 in the third. They scored 7 in the fourth, but we held on. And Johnny Mack Brown and Pooley Hubert were superstars for Alabama. Johnny Mack finished with 12 rushes, 76 yards. Pooley Hubert, our great All-American, finished with 15 carries, 97 yards. And then Pooley was 4 of 14. He only completed 4 passes, but they were for 141 yards.
Wow.
And he and Johnny Mack teamed up to beat Washington. And man, what was interesting was apparently the Pasadena, Los Angeles-based crowd was not happy with Washington because they refused to come play Southern Cal. And Mark may correct me on this. So the crowd out there was pro-Alabama.
Yeah.
And Washington coach had a quote after the game about how upset he was that the crowd turned against Coach Bradshaw.
He did.
And it was a pro-Alabama crowd. And the post-game press lauded Alabama, not just local press. I mean, all over the country. I want to read a couple. And back then, and Mark's the historian, especially in journalism, but the colorful language those sports reporters used back in the 20s, I really miss today. Not that I was there to see it firsthand, but just reading back then. But this is Paul Lowry.
Fire.
Yeah. Paul Lowry with the Los Angeles Times says, quote, "It looked for a while as if the purple tornado," that was what they called Washington back then, "might become a howling gale. The Huskies scoring a touchdown in each of the first two periods and generally managing to keep the upper hand. But the tide came in the third period, and before it ebbed, the purple tornado had almost degenerated into a gentle zephyr." And Maxwell Stiles, who wrote a great book on the Rose Bowl, which we quote many times, he said, "The Crimson Tide of Alabama ebbed and flowed in a maelstrom of mighty men. The purple tornado of Washington roared down the arroyo with gusty force, died down to a whisper in the shadows, then rose again in fury in the tense and teeming twilight." And then even Zip Newman, who we mentioned with the Birmingham News, "The West is left dazed and numb from the shock, for few in the great open spaces believed it was possible for Alabama to stop one of the greatest teams in the history of Pacific Coast gridiron lore." And it goes on and on. And these were reporters from all over the country. And we've got in the book more quotes than that, headlines from all over the country. And it was not Pasadena, Los Angeles, or Alabama news. It was national news. And that's why it's called the game that changed Southern football.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, not bad for a bunch of Southern boys that folks didn't believe belonged there, right? That's well, and especially Mark, Johnny Mack Brown. And, you know, outside of Tommy talked about the stats, but just what began to grow as far as lore about Johnny Mack Brown as a result of this game as well, right?
Yeah, I think part of it was the press coverage. You know, again, they were reading about Johnny Mack Brown on the West Coast, you know, all through the season because of the work that Zip Newman and Howard Pill and these folks were doing back in Birmingham. And Johnny Mack Brown was, I mean, it's not surprising he's the one who would become a movie star later because of the charisma he had. And so, as Tommy mentioned, he and Pooley Hubert were superstars at a time where there was no mass media, internet, no ESPN, none of that stuff,
Right,
obviously.
right.
They became that way because of sports writers covering those Alabama teams, and they were so dominant in that 1925 season as they came along. But they were also great to talk to the press. They were just good at this. And one of the you know, Zip Newman wrote something when they on one of the talked about, you know, their camera ready, basically. You know, he's talking about they were as much as stars to the stars as the stars were to them when they went and visited. Everybody wanted to meet those guys. And I think there was just something about him that, you know, he was an outstanding player. I mean, it just dominated on the field, and it wasn't just the Rose Bowl, but once he got out there and did so well, and it was the Pooley Hubert, Johnny Mack Brown show. Obviously, a lot of others contributed to this thing.
Sure.
But, you know, they were the superstars of the group in terms of national image. And, you know, Johnny Mack had that time. They were also being, you know, one of the things we mentioned quickly in the book, but, you know, they were getting offers to turn pro, that kind of thing. You know, pro football is so different than the NFL just getting started. NFL, you know, there was college.
Sure.
College, we talk about in the book, college all of a sudden was drawing these massive crowds around the country. Now, not particularly in the southern stadiums, which weren't that large yet, but, you know, for the first time, there were crowds in Chicago and the West Coast. There were, you know, the stadium itself. One of the things Jeff Coleman wrote on Alabama's very first practice is this is the first time these guys have been in a stadium like this that seats, he said on the Dispatch, 60,000, the largest crowd they had played to that entire season was up to 30,000, according to Jeff Coleman and what he wrote from that very first day of practice. They walked in and just sort of, not in awe of the stadium, I guess. I mean, they were there to practice, and Wade was out there, and he wasn't going to let him just be sightseers in the Rose Bowl Stadium, but they had never walked into anything like that, nor had most football players in the country never been out there. And so that was, I mean, we go into the book about the designer of the stadium itself but it was different than any other place. And as Tommy mentioned, there was no other Rose Bowl game. This was it. You didn't have a postseason game. This was it. And there was only one, and it was between two teams. So yeah, it was, you know, I think all that together, the more I look at it, I mean, first of all, it's the guys themselves, the players. These are outstanding players. They had an outstanding coach. No nonsense coach, and he got the best out of these folks. But also the press played a major role, and being so well known and so charismatic. There's no doubt the press had a lot to do with that.
Well,
Rick,
Tommy,
I want to add.
yeah, I was
I
going to
wanna
say, get
add
into
one
that a little
thing.
bit more.
Well, I was talking about Johnny Mack Brown. Now, I many years ago, wrote a book on different families of Alabama football, and the Brown family was one of them because the Browns had 4 family members play at Alabama. And of course, Johnny Mack was the most notable, probably because of his 40-year career in the movie industry.
Sure.
But after that game, the legendary Stanford coach, Glenn Pop Warner, said, quote, Johnny Mack Brown was the star of the Alabama team and played just as important a part as did Wilson, talking about George Wilson. And George Wilson, after the game, says that Johnny Mack Brown was all they said of him and more. He was about the fastest man in a football suit I have ever bumped up against. And I asked him about Johnny Mack, and he told me in detail, we got some of the quotes, and he told me in detail that the reason Johnny Mack didn't play much in the 23 seasons because he couldn't play defense and he couldn't block. And there you go. So that's
right.
And so he played more in 24, but in the 26 Rose Bowl game, he said that Johnny Mack may have saved the game because of a tackle he made on George Wilson. After George Wilson had come back into the game, he had the ball and was running, and Johnny Mack made the best tackle that Wallace Wade had ever seen. He said, I knew we had lost the game when I saw what was about to happen. He said, but, he couldn't play a lick of defense when he was a sophomore, but he made the best tackle. And the funniest quote that he had in that phone conversation, I said, Coach Wade, what did you think about Johnny Mack going into the movies? And just there was silence, and he finally said, well, he had to make a living somehow. And I think I end the chapter with that. And we have that quote in the book as well. But Johnny Mack, gosh, what a great career he had, not only in Alabama, but he was considered one of the best Western movie stars out there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was on the box of Wheaties, had his Dell comic book series. He was the man.
So Tommy, talk a little bit more about, you read a couple of quotes about the game itself, but how about the media reaction following and what began to happen in the national press as a result of Alabama's win?
I think we were put on the map at the time. I mean, like I said, it wasn't just Alabama and Southern California media. We were national figures at that time. And it continued. And, when Wallace Wade came back in 1980 for the 50-year reunion of the 1930 team and the 31 Rose Bowl team, Coach Bryant introduced Wallace Wade to the team at a practice. And he told the team that this is the start of Alabama football. He said, none of us would be here today if it weren't for Wallace Wade. And Wallace Wade died in 1986 and just has left a legacy and like no other. And it's amazing and unbelievable that a school could have had a Wallace Wade, a Frank Thomas, a Gene Stallings, Coach Bryant, a Nick Saban. It's incredible. And where we are today goes back to 100 years, a little more, 103, 104 years, to Wallace Wade coming on campus in 1923 and becoming our head coach. And so that's the national impact one game had. And a play here and there that went the other way, the game might have been different. And we might have still been where we are today.
Yeah.
But it sure is nice to talk about it 100 years later.
Yeah.
Well, Tommy, I've said this before, and I get emotional even when I think about this, but, my dad was 5 years old when we won the 1925 Rose Bowl. He was born in 1920. I was a change of life baby, so I got to be reared in a geriatric home. But my dad always said that game meant dignity.
Yeah.
And he always said that it did something for people in the South that was so much bigger than football. And it proved that, we belong. And for a kid that went on to a career and went into World War II and traveled around the world like so many guys did, and so much changed for so many people in the state of Alabama and around the South. And it happened as a result of, in many cases, what happened in that game. And so I think it's hard to underestimate, but it's also hard to believe. It's hard to fathom that something, that monumental could happen in that moment and really set off that chain of events that we're still living in the wake of now, 100 years later. So Mark, take us home. Let's talk about the train ride home. So they've won the ball game, and now they get to enjoy the spoils of war, right? As they make the train ride home. So tell us about it.
It was one big party, and it was a very big party, and it started on the field itself. The fans, they were, as Tommy mentioned, a lot of the California fans were pulling for Bama anyway, but particularly as the game wore on and it looked like Alabama, which had trailed at halftime, was going to be able to pull this out, right? So fans rushed the field, I guess, in an early indication of rushing the field. But it wasn't the entire stadium, but they rushed.
We don't do that anymore, though, right? Let's make that clear.
And we only did it then because of the California folks, too, involved, right?
Absolutely.
Now, they rushed the field. In fact, there's a quote. I just pulled this up from we have in the book, but Pooley Hubert said, the last quarter was the shortest I ever saw. I didn't know the game was over until the crowds were coming upon us. So it was like it began there. And then they finally back, took them a while, but to greeting the fans to get into the locker room, which Tommy and I have gone to that locker room, that small locker room they were in back then. We went there. In March at the Rose Bowl Stadium to look at that. But there were fans there. And then there were more than 500 fans waiting on them at the bus when they come out. And they're going to drive over to the Huntington Hotel, their hotel. And then they're going to leave the next morning back on the train. But when they got to the hotel, they also had Braven Dyer, who was this great LA Times writer with them. He goes in there in the hotel with him. He described it as a stack of telegrams big enough to knock your eye out. They were from all parts of the globe, but most of them were from the South. But it was like there were more than 300 telegrams waiting on them. What happened, and is that this game there was not a national radio broadcast for the first game ever. There was a local LA broadcast of the game. But across the South in particular, but around the country to some extent, there were people reading wire service ticker tape, AP ticker tape, in theaters. They would be in movie theaters or high school auditoriums. Like Tuscaloosa had two different ones. Yeah. Birmingham, Montgomery, Atlanta drew a huge crowd to the Biltmore Hotel in Atlanta at that time. They were reading this ticker tape play by play. So they were creating a live broadcast just by reading it to a live crowd, right? Even though it wasn't the actual radio broadcast. Well, then when Alabama wins, these people rush into the streets all over the South, including Atlanta rushing into the streets because they knew the impact was on Southern football. They knew that. And so this is all greeting them immediately after the game. And then they get back on the train the next morning and they start heading, and this time they're taking the more direct route. They're not going back to the city. One thing I didn't mention earlier is they had done one practice when they'd visited the Grand Canyon. After the Canyon trip, they came back down to Williams, Arizona. They actually, in their street clothes, took off their shirts and had a practice at a local stadium there. And that was the one real practice they sort of had. It wasn't a real, it was workout basically. But on the way back, no practices. They're winners, but they're on this Southern Pacific Railroad, the Sunset Limited line on the way back, which would connect later to the Southern Railway. But anyway, they're going Pasadena. There are cheering people. They're at different stops along the way. There are Alabama alums in Arizona. I mean, they're stopping at different places. People are waiting on them. The biggest throng they met, the biggest crowd was in New Orleans, where the place was packed. The Tulane players are out there to greet them. There's a band out there from Tulane was all thrilled about it, even though they were up for getting the invitation, right? And they may have actually got it. Who knows? It's a whole story, and they didn't. But their own administrators, again, this would be expense going on that long trip. It would be It was a break. This was something new for 10, anyway. The bottom line is Tulane shows the players come out to greet the Alabama players. There is a packed crowd there at the train station. They have a huge crowd there. And then they come on down through, they stopped in Meridian to pick up, Pooley Hubert's from Meridian. They picked up his mom in Meridian. She goes with them on into Tuscaloosa. They stop in, Livingston. Bill Little, what we sort of call the founder of Alabama football, who started this whole thing, he greets them. They were going to do a breakfast on another town, but the people would Bill Little bring some breakfast on the train for them. At least those are the reports we had from there. But everywhere along the way, everybody knows they're coming. People are putting in the papers what time they might arrive a couple of days before that. And then, it is kind of its own form of social media, these updated editions of daily newspapers. But then when they arrive in Tuscaloosa, nobody had ever seen anything like it. The AP thing, I think I got it. When they arrived in Tuscaloosa, the depot here was packed. As far as I could see, it was a huge crowd, so huge that they barely could get off the train. People ran onto the train, started carrying them off, on their shoulders to some extent, taking them to these wagons that were going to take them through downtown Tuscaloosa and then all the way down the UA and the quad and all that. But it took them forever to do this because there's a huge crowd and everybody's wanting to see them. Bands out there. But this thing from AP is like, no conquering heroes were ever welcomed home with greater acclaim than was Alabama's champion football team here today. Persons from all sections of the state and from all walks of life were in the crowd that jammed this little city when the Crimson Tide rolled in after a successful jaunt to the West Coast, where it captured the East-West football title in the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day. So, it was just massive celebrations. And, by that time, school had started back, and Dr. Denny graciously allowed the students to have a half day off, I believe.
Great thing.
So it was an incredible time. And I can't imagine, again, considering there is no massive social media, television, none of that stuff, can you imagine these crowds and exciting to see in person? They had to be there to see this, and
Right.
they greeted them all along the way. So yeah, it was a joyous ride and began a tradition. These train rides over Alabama's next few Rose Bowls became a very big tradition for the crowds to get on these rousing send-offs, to greet them all over the country as they came through, to see alums especially would be there waiting on them wherever they went. It was a big, big deal. And, I think we forget in Los Angeles, it was a big deal. Pro football, as we said, was nothing. The Rose Bowl was a big, big sports event. And if you were in it, and especially if you won it, you were going to be the toast of every town in America at that point.
Yeah. And it's hard to believe that we're just talking about the very first one, right? There's a whole much more of this history of Alabama and the Rose Bowl and what we've started in this edition. We're going to have a chance to unpack later. Tommy, Mark, thank you so much for taking us through an incredible history of all that has begun 100 years ago in the history of Alabama football in the Rose Bowl. And, what we know is that Alabama didn't just win a football game in Pasadena. They earned the national respect that day. The Rose Bowl didn't make Alabama great. It revealed what Alabama already was. And the Tide were going to be invited back again. And at that point, belief was going to turn into expectation. And so we hope you'll join us on the next edition of the Crimson Chronicles podcast.